Well, it's been pending out here for a while. Ukraine has said they will accept a 30-day ceasefire. The Russians, of course, except for the Easter Day ceasefire, have not been willing to go that far. But if the reporting is true, which is that the White House is open to describing Crimea as Russian, and maybe there are other inducements in there, perhaps as it pertains to sanctions, maybe as it pertains to no, never, Ukraine cannot get in NATO. I think it's conceivable that they could get there. But to me, remember, there's a long spectrum between ceasefire and peace agreement. Yeah. And so all these issues are going to have to be discussed again.
Well, and I wonder if resolution to these issues doesn't happen this week, if you expect the administration will stay on the table, because let's remind ourselves of the words of the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, just on Friday.
Now we've reached a point where we have other things we have to focus on. We're prepared to be engaged in this as long as it takes, but not indefinitely, not without progress. If this is not possible, we're going to need to move on. I think the president feels strongly that we've dedicated we've done more in 80 days than Biden ever did to bring this war to an end.
Not indefinitely. So if it's not this week, is it not ever?
It feels like he's leaving himself some room to continue after it, but I think they badly need some sort of points on the board this week, and I think they're probably doubling down to get to the 30-day ceasefire so that Trump can point to some progress in this. Otherwise, I think what we're going to see is just continued bloodshed on either side. I have my own doubts, by the way, about whether the Russians are really going to adhere to a ceasefire. I think it'll be sloppy, but we're just going to have to see what they come up with.
Well, it's quite an evolution to go from I can end this war in the first day to having still really no clear path on day 90. Did President Trump misread Vladimir Putin?
Well, I think there's also got to be some sort of recognition on the White House side that some of these might be insoluble issues. After all, Putin wants to control Ukraine, not just its territory, but to dominate its foreign and national security policy. This is something, of course, that the Ukrainians could never agree to. The Ukrainians cannot, by the way, either agree to a formal recognition of some of their territories, even those that the Russians don't actually control today, as formally part of Russia under some fiction that there are Russian speakers there. So I think there are a lot of fundamental issues that they're going to take months to get to, if ever.
Bloomberg is reporting today, Michael, that the U.S. is likely to hold talks in London on Wednesday with not just Ukrainian officials, but European officials as well, from the U.K., France, and Germany. What role should we expect Europe is going to play as this moves forward?
Well, they have felt locked out of the process so far, so I'm glad that Secretary Rubio over the last few days has begun to think of a role for them. I think for those of us that kind of want to see Ukraine's interests more represented, it's good to have these European nations involved. After all, Trump is saying this is your security problem in the long term, so they need to have some sort of role. They need to be there on the takeoff if Trump wants them to be there on the landing. So let's figure out a way to get them involved, get them motivated, because they're the ones that are going to have to supply a lot of this security assurance.
Iran talks will continue as long as there's another meeting. Is this progress?
I don't think so.
No?
I think there's a lot of delay inherent, and I think what really has happened over the last couple of weeks is that Steve Witkoff went in. I think he was agreeable. I think some of the things that the United States is willing to do was exaggerated. People came back last week. I think they stiffened some spines, and the United States is back to a tougher Iran policy, which is we don't want enrichment to continue, and we're not going to just give up on inspections of weaponization. We talked about this last week. Yeah. You have to have anytime, anywhere inspections by the International Watchdog Agency, and that has got to be part and parcel of anything going forward.
So if ultimately a deal is to be reached, how akin will it be to the original deal from 2015 that President Trump walked away from?
That's what makes this so hard for the Trump team. It would seemingly be easier to sign up to something that just looks like what Barack Obama did and maybe add a few years. But that will look terrible because President Trump called that the worst deal ever negotiated in the history of the world. And so they're going to have to come up with something that's stronger. And when the hawks get involved, like Marco Rubio, like Mike Waltz, they're saying we shouldn't have any enrichment whatsoever, and we ought to be able to have some assurances that you're not thereby trying to weaponize resultant fissile material to fashion it into a bomb. Those are big things we're asking for. They're the right things, but that's something that Iran's not going to be able to accept anytime soon. So we've got to let maximum pressure play out over time. By the way, I don't know why we're in such a rush. I think there is some time to let Iran bake in sort of the sanctions oven for a while.
Interesting. We're having this conversation amid another scandal at the Pentagon. The White House is calling it fake news now by NPR that the president is looking for a new defense secretary. But it's no wonder why we're having reports like this today. Another signal chat is being reported by the New York Times in which Pete Hegseth shared these Yemeni attack plans with his wife and some other folks in his personal life. Also follows the departure of 4 officials at the Pentagon last week, fired for alleged media leaks. One of them is John Elliott, although I believe he also wanted to leave the Pentagon here. You can frame that as you want. Left the department last week with an op-ed over the weekend. Pentagon is in disarray under Hegseth's leadership. Is he right?
He needs, I think Hegseth needs to come out and actually demonstrate that he's in control of the department. I think one way to do that might be to come out and actually brief the Pentagon press corps. Talk about the things that he's trying to do. He's often talking about increasing the lethality of the force. There are big questions about DOJ. There are big questions about where the department is on these foreign policy issues of the day. I think that would be the best way for Hegseth to try and demonstrate that he has control, that he has strength, that he has some strong policy views, and that he's doing all these things in service of the president. I think to just totally dismiss everything as a hoax is sort of beyond the point. He ought to come out and talk about, hey, here's what I'm trying to do, and sign up to that.
But even if he is trying to do all of those things, is it not disqualifying to share the whereabouts of American airmen, the plans for F-18 flights in Yemen with your wife, with your brother, with your personal attorney, people who are not employed by the Defense Department, not entitled to receive that kind of information?
I think so. I mean, there's no real way to say this other than maybe he should just say, you know what, I made a mistake. It wasn't classified, but I probably shouldn't have been sending it, and move on. Instead, I think there's a lot of attacks. There's impugning of the motives of the people that are reporting this.
Yeah.
I think he'd be safer just to sort of say, hey, you know what, some mistakes were made. There's an IG's investigation going into this, but here's what I'm trying to do is SecDef, A, B, and C.
Well, you know, of course, he's talking about anonymous leaks here. We saw 4 people shown the door. The person I mentioned, John Elliott, says that there are more bombshells to come, likely in short order, even bigger this week. Does the Pentagon have a leak problem?
It sounds like something is going on for sure, where there are disaffected people across the department. I'm sure there's been a lot of China broken as the new team has taken over.
Yeah.
So maybe what he's referring to is that maybe some uniformed military are going to resign or be fired. Hard to say for sure, but it feels quite rocky over there.
Wow.
Well, and I'm wondering about the leaking coming out of the State Department as well, as the Secretary, Marco Rubio, pushes back also as fake news, reporting that there's this kind of draft executive order that is circulating among diplomats that shows how dramatically the administration is considering reshaping the Defense Department. And I wonder, Michael, your specific thoughts on the idea that it could include the closing of a vast number of embassies in Africa. Does that not just cede to China?
Well, I was going to say the same thing. That is the battleground where we are competing with China for influence, the global south. I don't think it's a good idea for us to be shutting down diplomatic offices in Africa. Maybe there's something to be done in Western Europe and Canada, some consulates here and there where the power has shifted to Asia, or we need to get into Africa. So I don't want to begrudge them. I'm glad they're taking a big strategic look at the State Department. God knows it needs some reform, but I wondered, like you did, about whether Africa was the place where we should be uprooting consulates.